Decentralized renewable energy is less lootable. By being more decentralized, including for renewables, it's potentially more resilient to certain types of attacks. I'm a supporter of renewable energy. I guess you can say I'm a fan of wind. That was a terrible joke. I apologize. Imagine that we fulfill the Herculean task of getting to net zero emissions by 2050. We decarbonize the economy, but then in 2051, we have a nuclear war. We are unfortunately still doomed because this is kind of like a Pokemon problem. You got to catch them all.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Powering the Future podcast. I'm Ben Backwell. I'm the CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council, and I'm the chair of the Global Renewables Alliance. I'm really excited today to have on the show Luke Kemp, who is the author of Goliath's Curse, the history and future of societal collapse. It's a book that's had a lot of impact and was recommended to me by friends of mine who work at the UN and UNESCO and other agencies. So Luke, welcome to the show. Really excited to meet you.
Ben, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk.
Good. Okay. Well, look, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this. I mean, you're Australian. How did you get into the subject of existential risk? And what is the discipline of existential risk?
I am Australian. I was originally a lecturer in climate change science and policy back at the Australian National University. And then in the process of lecturing for that course, I realized that there were many other things apart from climate change that could lead to a global catastrophe. Imagine that we fulfill the Herculean task of getting to net zero emissions by 2050. We decarbonize the economy, but then in 2051, we have a nuclear war. We are unfortunately still doomed. So I started to think about this in terms of what are all the big different challenges and threats we face, and how can we overcome all of them together? Because this is kind of like a Pokemon problem. You got to catch them all. That took me to Cambridge at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. Existential risk is essentially any risk that could cause either global societal collapse or, in the very worst case, human extinction.
That is quite heavy things to be thinking about in your day-to-day life. And I've noticed in the reaction to your book, you seem to have taken on the mantle of Dr. Doom in some of the reviews. That mantle used to belong to Nouriel Roubini, right? The guy who predicted the financial crash back in the noughties, right? But you seem to have taken on that title. I mean, I found the book quite hopeful, I've got to say, and I really found it very engaging as well. I mean, it's an extraordinary book. It's a big book, right? And there's a lot in it. It's a lot to kind of get through, but I didn't find it depressing. How do you live with looking at existential risk and the sense that things could end the world kind of day to day? How do you work with that?
Surprisingly well. We often joke that the field selects for people who have a high baseline happiness because you kind of have to be naturally pretty cheerful to be dealing with these kind of topics day in, day out. The funny thing for me was writing this book in many ways was an uplifting experience of sorts. While I'm more pessimistic about the future, I'm actually more optimistic about humans, and I'm more optimistic about our ability to create different kinds of social structures that create not just a world where collapse is less of a threat, but also a far better world as well.
Yeah, I mean, let's get into it. I mean, first of all, what I want to do first of all is ask you what are the main sources of what are existential risk, generalized risk to our society. Let's look at those first, just so we can get the listeners kind of familiar with the territory, and then we'll go on to talk a little bit about Goliath and the idea of Goliath.
Most of my colleagues tend to deal with the pretty well-known, frightening list of threats, things like nuclear weapons, extreme climate change, global ecological degradation, including the loss of biosphere integrity, engineered pandemics, so pandemics that are actually created through genetic engineering, and advanced AI systems, including potentially things like coordinated killer robots. I tend to think about this in a slightly different way. When we think about risk, risk is composed of 4 determinants. You have the hazard, vulnerability, response, and exposure. In general, when we talk about these things like nuclear weapons and climate change, we're talking about the hazards, the things that cause damage. To me, the more interesting question is, why do we, as a global industrialized society, keep on producing these things? The Center for Study of Existential Risk back in 1950, if it existed, would have only really studied one thing, nuclear weapons. And yet now we deal with a plethora of things. To me, the bigger question is, what's the root causes? In the book, I go into this and I identify them roughly as the dominance hierarchies we live in, what I call Goliaths, and the fact that these seem to inevitably end up in things like arms races, races for resources, and races for status. And until we address those fundamental underlying drivers, it's likely going to be a very rough time in the long term.
Yeah, I found that aspect of it really interesting, and we'll come on in a second to talk about this concept of Goliath that you came up with, which seems to kind of, in a way, be a concept that kind of encapsulates that kind of systematic, kind of risky behavior and the drivers of that in some way. If I'm
Hmm.
getting this right. Um, but first of all, I mean, we're used to a society where we're being told all the time that things are getting safer, or at least until a few years ago. And there was this whole idea that, people are more prosperous, there's less violence, and so on. And one of the things that really struck me about your book, you had a bit in it where you were saying, look, you've got less of a chance of being bludgeoned to death. I think you said if you were, as a citizen of ancient Uruk, you would have had a higher chance of being bludgeoned to death by someone. And we live in general more peaceful lives, but at the same time, the kind of risk of wiping ourselves out completely is way higher. And I was really interested in your thinking there. Can you kind of explain how that works a little bit?
Exactly. So today, I'm far less likely to die a violent death than a citizen of ancient Uruk or Egypt or the Shah dynasty in China. And yet, none of those regimes, the world at the time, did not have access to something like nuclear weapons, which within the space of a year could kill up to half humanity. And that's the kind of interesting situation we're in, where we experience relatively low rates of violence, but all you need is one nuclear war, and suddenly the graph of violence looks entirely different. It has this enormous spike. And when you look at history, most events tend to be dominated by what we call these tail risks, these low probability, high impact events. Most deaths from wars are dominated by just a small handful of wars. Most economic losses are dominated by just a couple of economic events. And it's really misleading to ignore the risk of having something like nuclear war and just say, "Look, right now, we're in the most peaceful time possible." Is it really that peaceful if we have things like nuclear weapons in our arsenal?
Yeah, and you've got this concept of what you call fattening tails, which I found really, really interesting. Can you explain that a little bit as well?
As mentioned, a tail risk is essentially a lower probability, high consequence or high impact risk. And in general, when it comes to risk distribution, you tend to have things which are more likely but less consequential, and you have a tail of lower probability, higher impact events. And what we're doing here when we think about violence, for instance, is we're essentially fattening the tail. So the observed rate of violence is quite low, but that tail risk of really high casualties is getting fattened. The ability for us to kill very large numbers of people, 10% or more of the population at a global level, that didn't exist previously and it does now. And this is true for numerous different things, including things like, say, for instance, a pandemic. Right now, we have not entirely conquered infectious disease, as is quite clear from COVID-19, but it's certainly nowhere near as bad as it was historically. But we also didn't have the ability to potentially craft new, more potent, worse diseases. And we are now developing and may have already developed the ability to do so, which could mean pandemics that are worse than what we've faced throughout history. And again, what you're doing there is essentially fattening the tail risk.
You also talk a little bit about that we are better at managing society and risks than we've been in the past. I mean, we've got this whole paraphernalia of international organizations. We're better technically than we were at any time in history. We're able, our science is more advanced. So we've got all this kind of structure and framework and machinery for managing things. Why isn't that reducing risk?
I think it is in some ways, right? Like the reason why we have, for instance, low rates of perceived violence is in large part because of all this social infrastructure we have. Most pre-modern states do not have a police force, let alone intelligence agencies, mass surveillance systems, and very large-scale bureaucracies and administrations. We have all those things now, and they have some good things. They do usually quell rates of violence among citizens. They can also enable things like the large spread distribution of vaccination programs. They can also be quite bad as well. They can, of course, create social stability, but also foster autocracy. Why is it that we also seem to have this increase in tail risk? So why is it you can have polities like the United States, which are more stable and resilient than those of the past, and yet also have enormous nuclear arsenals of over 3,000 weapons? The answer in large part is because the Goliath, the overarching system of domination, is producing the risk in the first place. It has an interest in trying to make sure it's stable, to quell resistance from citizens, but also in trying to produce new weapons to compete with other states, empires, etc. So there's really no tension here per se. It's that in general, the production of big existential risk is done by a very small number of institutions. And those are institutions that also tend to benefit from having stability.
Yeah, let's dig into that just a little bit more. So, I mean, what you're saying is that you've got these big state apparatuses that are there to, in some way, manage risk, manage citizens, manage society, but at the same time, they're the ones creating kind of global scale existential risk because of things like interstate rivalry, competition for resources. I mean, is that your argument?
Roughly, yes. In the book, I talk about the agents of doom, that when you look at the production of existential risk, it's highly concentrated, it's done for profit, and it's done in secret. Look at climate change. Approximately 80% of cumulative global emissions comes from just 10 countries, if you count the EU as one. When it comes to nuclear weapons, roughly 87% of the stockpiles held by two countries, Russia and the US. And they're also the ones who are pushing forward the newest innovations, things like hypersonic missiles. Similarly, if you're worried about advanced AI systems, there's only really three big companies who are pushing them right now: Anthropic, DeepMind, OpenAI, all of which are headquartered in the United States. And in each one of these areas, they also tend to be very secretive. Anthropic, DeepMind, and the leading AI labs all use non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreements to stop whistleblowers. Nuclear weapons, the Manhattan Project is essentially synonymous for secret big government project. And fossil fuel companies knew about climate change back in the 1970s and intentionally buried the information, including their own internal modeling. Hence, across the board, there's these institutions which benefit from producing existential risk and intentionally create it. As mentioned, they also do benefit from having a stable society. ExxonMobil, etc., they want to have states that protect their property rights. Militaries in the US want to make sure they have a population they can tax and hence have a bigger budget for. So these two things go in tandem, that you need to have stability in order to have growing, powerful Goliaths. But those growing, powerful Goliaths, empires, states, and corporations all tend to produce much larger amounts of risk due to these underlying factors I spoke about, things like arms races, racist resources, racist status.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, I mean, one thing that really strikes me is you're kind of in this world where if you can build it, somebody's going to do it, even if we know that it's going to be potentially disastrous. And I think we've been in that world for quite a while. I mean, it's interesting. I look a lot at things like science fiction,
Hmm.
and pretty much everything that science fiction warns people not to do ends up 20 years being built in some way, right? Um, and there's some logic there, some strange logic, right, of building weapons that pretty soon are going to proliferate to everybody else, right?
Yes and no. Both myself and a colleague, Matthias Mast, were actually putting together a big database of all the times where we abandoned certain technologies, or even where we were capable of pursuing and building certain technologies, but chose not to do so. A great example is at one stage, Edward Teller, the physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project, he pitched to the Senate the idea of making a bomb that could destroy entire continents, basically a gigaton warhead. And the Senate simply said, no, this is beyond the pale. This is too much. And they never pursued that program. And there are hundreds of examples of this throughout history. I think there is certainly a case to be made that when you have strong competitive pressures, there usually is going to be more convergence towards certain types of technology. But that being said, often we're kind of making these competitive pressures up. And this is where the kind of racketeering element comes back in. If we look at, say, for instance, AI and the idea of we can build it, ergo we have to, that's almost a quote word for word from Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI. And yet when we look here, OpenAI, Anthropic, DeepMind, they've all used the excuse of we have to do this, otherwise China will get there first. And yet, in reality, when you actually look at it, China's not really racing the US. They're moving far slower than the US is, and they don't seem to have any inclination to race the US in this regard. There's some really good work by my colleague Shauna Hegarty on exactly this, that the idea of a China-US AI race is largely a myth being used by producers to justify building new things. So I think, in a way, there's a bit more hope here that we often do have choice over technology. Competition can be a bad thing. It can create this kind of pressure to create certain kinds of technology. But more often than not, it's being used as a political strategy to justify building technologies which we know won't be good for most of the world.
Yeah, I mean, AI is an interesting one because you've got half the people in the AI industry warning of existential threat and potential doom from AI, and then at the same time building it as
Yeah.
fast as they can, right? I mean, I was really struck, recently by Elisa Bukowski's book. It's called
If anyone builds
"If
it,
Anyone
everyone
Builds It,
dies.
Everyone Dies," right?
Yeah, beautiful title.
But then he's also the guru of all the Bay Area, Silicon Valley types, right? He's out there, having drinks with the same people who are building the stuff, right? And he's the undisputed kind of guru of these people, right? And there was this incident on Twitter where Sam Altman made a comment about him. He said we've never met, and then a few months later it was Sam Altman, Grimes, and him over drinks taking selfies, right? When the whole
Yeah,
argument with
Altman.
his book is that you've got to shut down AI research, right now, and actually nuke any country that refuses to cooperate around restricting it, right? So
Yeah.
there seems to be this element of kind of playing with the kind of kind of doom and the
Mm,
idea that this is going to change everything, as a way of kind of selling it as a very powerful technology that can't be resisted. And I think I mean, among your fellow academics, I mean, you're looking at existential risk. There's a whole bunch of people who are looking at that question from a completely different point of view.
mm,
I'm thinking particularly the academics around Oxford, for instance,
yeah.
people like Nick Bostrom and Toby Ord. Yeah, their way of looking at existential risk seems to me looking at millions of years in the future. And there's this whole kind of idea around long-termism. I mean, explain to me a little
Precisely.
bit the differences there and what the discussion is, because I mean, you're looking at things that
Mm.
are happening right now. Um, a lot of what they're doing seems to be saying, well, if we have the AI kind of in a million years, these are going to be the issues we're facing.
Mm. First of all, when it comes to Zukowski, there was a really funny tweet from Altman which said, IMO, no one has done more to accelerate AI than Eliezer Yudkowsky. And sadly, I think that's accurate. I think both Yudkowsky and Bostrom, by constantly saying, this is the most powerful technology we can build, whoever builds it will take over the world, that's like chucking up a flag for all the powerful entrepreneurs, militaries in the world, that this is something you should pursue. It wasn't a good strategy at all to begin with. And I actually remember having a debate with my colleagues when I first joined the field that this, I just don't think is a winning strategy. Same with creating OpenAI, the idea of creating a firm that's supposed to race to the front and then say, let's talk about safety, particularly in a place like Silicon Valley, where you're so easily corrupted by power, there's such strong competitive pressures, it was always a terrible strategy. I think when it comes to AI right now, there are some people who genuinely believe that this could destroy the world, but it's better if they build it than if China does. There's some people who genuinely believe that. I think there's also others, probably Altman included, who are just using this as a smokescreen to justify essentially forging ahead as quickly as possible and to amplify and hype the abilities of the technology. You mentioned Nick Bostrom, Toby Ord, the kind of some of the original pioneers in the field of existential risk. I've often called their approach the techno-utopian approach, because the way they define existential risk is not as something that causes human extinction necessarily or global societal collapse. Instead, for them, it's anything that prevents us achieving civilizational potential. And in their view, that potential is that we have to become a highly technologically advanced, spacefaring civilization that essentially takes over the entire galaxy. And it's funny they call themselves long-termists because in many ways they're actually very short-termist. They tend to believe that we're going to get AI in the next few years, and whoever programs the AI, that's going to determine the future of millions of years thereafter. So for them, they're actually, in many ways, weirdly very short-termist, but they think through philosophically, what are the long-term implications? For me, the biggest difference here is that I try to look at history and understand what are the big trajectories. I try to think much more broadly, and I try to also think politically as well. It's, again, you can't ignore that there are certain people profiting from the creation of these technologies.
I want to play devil's advocate a little bit with you. I
Please.
mean, AI is good, right? I mean, it's going to solve a lot of problems. I mean, I hear this all the time in the world that we move in energy, right? I mean, we constantly hear this idea that there's kind of two levels to it. There's a kind of human scale or society scale level in which they can say, okay, it can be very useful for looking at things like managing technical issues like grid management, um, doing weather prediction, building these kind of digital twins of the earth and then being able to trade around, weather patterns and predict, what
Mm,
energy is going to do, what grids are doing. How do you calculate what the impact of many different variable sources are on grids? Those kind of technical things. And some of those are in the area of what they call physical AI rather than large language models, right? And then there's a kind of a macro argument, I guess, which is that the AI is so powerful, it's going to solve climate change and all these
mm.
things, which I think there's a much higher degree of skepticism around, right? But certainly for many states, definitely, and I think for some people, the idea is the AI is going to, there's still the idea, I guess, that the AI is going to solve problems and that it's going to solve medical problems and cure cancer. Although, the gloss is kind of falling off, I think, for me. Um, but I mean, can it be a force for good? I mean, there's NGOs that are putting forward AI for good. I mean, how much of it is the technology? Is the technology shaped by the kind of societies we're in? I mean, what's the problem there? Is it a technology problem, or is it a deployment problem, or is it a deeper societal problem?
It's worthwhile remembering that social media, when it was ushered in, was also supposed to connect the world and usher in an age of peace, prosperity, and connectivity. Things turned out quite differently. And now we're starting to get bans on social media, for instance, in Australia, under the age of 16. I think this is a problem of AI and many other technologies reflect the interests of those building it, and they also tend to amplify existing institutions. We could certainly use AI for a bunch of really important socially beneficial projects. Things like doing democracy at scale using digital democratic tools. Things like better improving coordination, preventing arms races through new transparency measures. But let's face it, that's not what we're putting the money and the projects towards. And the bigger problem across all of this is that these companies don't have to deal with the costs that they're imposing on everyone else. All the way from the fact that the AI is built upon mass theft of data through to the environmental impacts and the day-to-day impacts, things like AI-induced psychosis. the companies don't have to pay for it. It's what we often, in a somewhat anodyne way, call externalities in economics. But because of that, the companies are not usually going to do the thing which is socially beneficial. You see the same with fossil fuels and many other areas. And until you make them honest, until you make them pay the real price of what they're producing, you're likely not to see technologies that are acting in the greater good.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, I mean, like I say, I mean, we are seeing some really interesting applications of AI in
Mm.
more technical areas around,
Yeah.
physical AI, around things like grid management, even things like predictive maintenance of wind turbines, just kind of understanding large scale modeling. There's very big, concerted, serious attempts
Hmm.
to try and model the weather in a better way that allows better energy management system. But it's a very long way away from the claims of the large language models and the kind of general claims of super intelligence, right? I mean, it's the stuff that seems to be working for us is quite specific technical in quite specific technical areas where it can be quite useful and is also not mimicking humans, right? It's machine learning for specific aims, right? Rather, almost like teaching a AI to play chess rather than teaching it to do everything, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, from where we come from as the renewable energy industry, I mean, we like to think we are representing a more hopeful
Mm.
future of the energy world. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is because renewable energy is an indigenous resource, right? So, I mean, you can't take the wind from someone else, or the sunlight that's falling on that area, right? So these are resources which are captured by local, populations, and they're put into electricity. So, I mean, I'm kind of thinking and using your terminology that renewable energy is less of a lootable resource. And we know that fossil fuel industry has thrived for a long time on conflict because of the way it worked with trading and arbitrage and trading between different availability of resources across different regions and it's it's something people fight over, those resources, and we
Hmm.
obviously renewables we see as something that's provides more resilience, more
Mm.
security for local populations. I mean, that's the first thing, and I'd be interested to hear what you think of that. And secondly, I mean, we are in electrification, so we're hoping that we have a completely different ecological environmental impact because we're not putting out carbon, but again, we're not so much about burning things and explosive impact rather than allowing things to function. I mean, what do you think there's some hope in the fact that the world is turning to renewables? I mean, we are now the biggest source of at least electric power now and new power around the world.
I think there is. I'm a supporter of renewable energy. I guess you can say I'm a fan of wind. That was a terrible joke. I apologize. Um, but there's several different reasons to be hopeful about the turn towards renewable energy. One is, as you mentioned, at least decentralized renewable energy is less lootable. It's something which is more amicable to being owned by individuals, owned by individuals or small communities. And also by being more decentralized, it also means you're less likely to have one catastrophic point of failure. If you have an entire electricity grid dependent upon one or two key areas, it's quite easy to cripple it potentially. When it's more decentralized, including for renewables, it's potentially more resilient to certain types of attacks. A second reason is what I talk about in the book as energy ratio. So this is how much energy you get from a source relative to how much you have to spend to get that energy. So, for instance, the very first oil wells would give us roughly 200 barrels of oil for every barrel we spent getting stuff out of the ground. They were incredibly prolific. You'd tap the ground in Texas and you'd have huge geysers spout up black gold into the atmosphere. That's no longer the case. Fossil fuels have been drying up in terms of the energy ratio. Depending upon where you count the energy ratios, whether it's when it enters the economy or its end use, it could be somewhere between 20 to 5 to 1. So for every barrel of oil spent, we only get 5 to 20 out of the ground, and that's getting worse over time. Renewables are kind of the opposite story. They're depending upon the source, roughly like 20 to 25, but they're improving due to technological and efficiency improvements. So renewables could actually be one way to avoid this, what some people call energy cliff that we're facing. A third reason here is, as you'd expect, simple climate change. Renewables are just one of the best ways to electrify and to avoid excess carbon emissions. They're effective, necessary ways to mitigate climate change. And in the book, I go into all the reasons climate change is a genuine catastrophic risk we should be deeply concerned about. The only area where I'm slightly more concerned is renewables still depend upon supply chains that are often built upon inequality and extraction. So a big one here that I mentioned in the book is cobalt. So cobalt is necessary for building batteries, for instance. And roughly 70% of the world's cobalt supply comes from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, often mined by people getting paid a couple of dollars a day in incredibly exploitative extractive conditions. But if you can find a way to make those supply chains more fair, I think renewables are basically a win-win.
Yeah, and I mean, we're certainly conscious of those social justice elements that you talk about, Luke. And you mentioned cobalt, which obviously has a very outsized role within the electric vehicle
Yep.
sector. We also have critical minerals that we use, although they're very small but valuable quantities, and those supply chains are quite concentrated and quite difficult to manage environmentally and so on. So we're quite conscious also of the impact that we have more widely, and we're also conscious of kind of that we're kind of pulled into conflict as well, and there seems to be increasing pressure to kind of bifurcate um, the world in terms of supply chains, and in terms of who's doing what. And we're in a situation right now where it seems almost that one part of the world is pushing in one direction,
Mm,
particularly in the US, and parts of the US apparatus pushing towards a kind of return to fossil fuels and pressuring others to do so. And then others becoming what they're calling now, electro states that are basically based around
mm,
electrification and based around large scale deployment of renewables, and there seems to be a kind of bifurcation um, going on, but also kind of attempts to weaponize the risk as well, particularly around things like
mm,
infrastructure and infrastructure and grid. And those kind of things, and who controls the
precisely.
grid, and can it be taken down, and so on and so on. I mean, I guess one hopeful thing we see is that, as you said, renewables can be quite decentralized. And for instance, in Ukraine, we're building wind turbines more quickly than people can knock them down, and they're actually very very resilient because they're kind of fairly decentralized in what they're doing. I wanted to ask you about, I mean, another aspect that is important for us, and you're someone who's written quite a lot about international climate negotiations and the COP meetings, the climate change negotiations, conference of the parties. Um, it's a fairly sophisticated problem that requires a very high level of international cooperation. Yeah, and it's pretty much a consensus based approach these days. You need at least the vast majority of countries to sign up for the approach. Um, and at the same time, people's ability to kind of deal with the problem and cooperate, manage the knowledge, maintain a common narrative seems to be under threat, and particularly from things like disinformation, and often disinformation using technologies like AI. I mean, in your experience and looking at all this stuff, how do we get to that level of international cooperation and societal cooperation that we can deal with these kind of, tricky, wicked kind of type problems?
My PhD thesis was focused on how do you have successful international agreements without the participation or leadership of the United States. There's a long history of successful agreements having the leadership of the US. Things like, of course, the World Trade Organization, the Montreal Protocol, and others. And we are facing a problem where the US is obviously now disengaging increasingly from multilateralism, But even before that, the US had a very long track record of refusing to either sign but not ratify, to not legally participate in, or to neither sign nor ratify international agreements. As a part of presenting on this, I used to have at least one slide with size 6 font, so really, really small, and it just had lines and lines of different trees they hadn't signed or ratified, and actually went off the slide. You'd have to have multiple slides to do it. So the US already has a long history of this, but it is getting worse under the leadership of Trump and others. So how do you have successful agreements without the US leading? The conclusion I came to is that you tend to need to have critical mass agreements. So a small number of countries taking very ambitious action and moving forward without everyone else joining on board. When we look at things like the Montreal Protocol, it started with only a few dozen countries, but it had very deep rules, strong mechanisms to essentially enforce those rules and to penalize those who weren't part of the agreement, and it grew over time until eventually it's pretty much universal now. Likewise, when it came to the World Trade Organization, that originally started as the GATT, which I think was only something like 28 members to the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs. Again, strong rules, it expanded over time. And even when you think about renewables, people tend to point towards all the action happening in China, and yet in many ways that was enabled by the falling price of, in particular, offshore wind and solar PV. And that in turn was driven by the actions of countries like Germany and Denmark, who were doing this in part because of the Kyoto Protocol. For me, I'd be advocating for international agreements where you have a coalition of the willing who recognize this is in their own self-interest and they move forward ambitiously, progressively, with a willingness to penalize others if necessary, including through things like carbon border adjustments.
I wonder also on a level of public engagement. And I mean, if you think back to the time of Glasgow and the Glasgow COP, I mean, there were
Uh,
hundreds of thousands of people in the streets marching around climate. There was the whole Fridays for the Future, school strikes, even in the village that I was living in at that time, the local school kids were going on climate strike. And that energy seemed to dissipate somewhat during the pandemic and COVID. And then with that, we've also now got a more fragmented information space with social media, with proliferation of fake news and
uh,
disinformation and so on. I mean, I guess one of the things that comes out throughout your book is that generally, if you consult people, ordinary people, they're more sensible than the governments, and they're more sensible than the Goliaths around risk. I think is one of the hopeful things I got from your book. But then, how do we ensure that people are actually engaged with these issues when it's very hard, when it's very easy just to try and ignore them, particularly when things look quite gloomy?
yeah, so we tend to think of democracy as the enemy when it comes to moving quickly on things like climate change, and that simply isn't the case. In the book, I go through a large number of different pieces of evidence suggesting democracy actually tends to result in more resilient states. And even today, when it comes to things like should we ban lethal autonomous weapons? Should we act more on climate change, including through having higher carbon prices? Should we have potentially a ban on nuclear weapons? You tend to have strong public majorities across each of these positions, including, as mentioned, also slowing down and potentially banning superintelligence. In general, people actually have pretty progressive opinion when it comes to global risk, and it gets even better when you put them into these what are called deliberative assemblies and juries, or citizens' assemblies and juries. Essentially, you randomly pick people from across the population, you put them together in a room, you have them informed by experts, and they debate, deliberate, and eventually you take the average across them if you can't get consensus. That tends to result in really surprisingly both well-informed and progressive legislation, but it also tends to depolarize the people in the group as well, and is often seen as more legitimate for those outside of it. As you mentioned, one of the key problems we face is that people right now are disenfranchised. People right now don't feel like democracy is working, that importantly, they have little to no voice in the existing political system. How do we change that? I don't entirely know. I think part of it's going to be winding back the measures that are currently being implemented that in many ways try to reduce democracy, but also reduce things like social mobilization.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting for us is that if you look at the kind of overall big polls, like the big
Mm,
global polls that they do every year, concern around climate change has held up really strongly, and it's still, one of the top two, three, four concerns in pretty much every country
yeah.
around the world, and also support for renewable energy. Again, if you look at it on a macro level, it's very, very strong. I guess the question is as you say, I mean, it's all about participation, and participation seems to be, the key for having more sensible approaches to risk and the big societal questions. Um, but we're also seeing what seems to me like a fragmentation of the landscape. And it's very hard for people to see what's really happening because the information landscape is fragmenting. But also, climate change by its nature is unpredictable, right? I mean, we've had just massive snowfall. We're still getting massive snowfall on the East Coast of the US, and the kind of predictable, jokes like, hey, how can these people talk about climate change when it's so cold? Ha ha ha, kind of thing. And then, massive flooding in other places, tropicalization and kind of global wetting in other places, right? And none of that negates the underlying pattern of rising temperatures, but it makes it quite hard for people to understand it, I think, in a localized way, and it's not linear. Um, so it's a problem that requires quite a lot of kind of science, putting together lots of different viewpoints together in a kind of global scientific framework. And obviously, if you've got then attention spans being undermined, people putting out false information and disinformation, it can be pretty disruptive, I think, to people's ability to take a stance. And I just wonder, I mean, of all the risks, I wonder just how big a risk it is, people just, fragmenting because of, algorithms and being in different information bubbles. And I wonder whether that's become more
Mm.
important for you and your colleagues in the last period.
If concentrations of power are one of the key things driving us towards collapse, then collective action and having people connected is one of the key ways forward. And if you're doing things to fragment them to prevent collective action, then that is enormously detrimental. It's worthwhile noting, of course, we've always had disinformation, misinformation to an extent. Back in the 1970s, I mentioned, you had these big campaigns being run by fossil fuel companies to cast doubt on the science of climate change, and they did it quite successfully. That's not to take away from the fact that today we do have new technologies and new strategies that are increasingly fragmenting the information ecosystem. This can in some ways be a good thing. I think sometimes having more decentralization, like on energy, can be a good thing when it comes to information as well. But not when you have armies of bots producing intentionally false information, including to try to confuse and rig large language models and AI systems. It's not a good thing when people don't have a good way to select what is better or worse information sources. One of the good things here is that when it comes once again to open democracy, you kind of mitigate against that. If you're primarily relying upon having groups of people informed by experts, changing their minds, getting new information, they tend to actually make pretty good decisions. They tend not to be prey to misinformation and disinformation. It's a way of creating a microcosm of a much healthier information ecosystem. Hence, I think this would go at least some way to improving that problem, but we still need to find ways, of course, to improve the information system in general across people.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting food for thought there. Listen, we're going to come to the end soon, but I wanted to ask you, what's the reaction been like to your book from people, and do you find people are hopeful? Do you find people are scared? Does it, in your experience, does it work? Do people need to be scared about what's going on? I mean, how do you see it?
Overall, it's been surprisingly positive. I wrote a book which had over 1,000 endnotes and is over 469 pages long. I wasn't expecting it to be particularly well received or even a bestseller, but it's done actually surprisingly well in that regard, which does buoy me, gives me some hope. And the reaction has varied. I had a lot of people who do see it as more of a a strangely hopeful text. And some people who seem to dislike that. I think there's a lot of people in the kind of doomer prepper community who dislike any attempt to think about how do we extract ourselves out of this mess. I think those people, frankly, just want to have validation that the world is doomed. And while I do think that self-termination and collapse is the most likely outcome in the long term, it's not inevitable. And anyone who thinks that doesn't do forecasting, because we know we're not very good at forecasting the future. There are ways out of this, and I think a lot of people, hopefully after reading the book, realize that the future is not set in stone. And that's one of the beautiful things here that I got from the book personally from writing it, is that there are many ways forward, and preventing collapse also means building a better world. And that importantly, we're not even trying right now. When you look at the amount of money and resources we're putting towards improving democracy, for instance, relative to how much we're funding mass surveillance systems and facial recognition technology, we spend at least 100 times more on mass surveillance than we do in democracy. If we aligned money and resources with what our values are, if we moved money away from fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies towards renewables, away from mass surveillance towards democracy, away from nuclear weapons towards arms races, we could change the world very quickly. I mean, I don't see any reason why we should live in a world where we can fear that we could recreate intelligence in silicon, but we can't effectively do democracy at scale. That's not reality, that's a choice. And I hope that the book is giving people an indication that it's a choice that we can make differently going into the future, even if it's going to be desperately difficult.
It's a hopeful message, Luke, and at least that's the I took a lot of hope from the book. I'm glad you wrote it. Glad you came
Thank
on
you.
the on the show, and I hope we can in our industry add a little bit of hope, at least that it's possible to do things in the right way that is making the world a better place and respecting the planetary boundaries and giving people some alternatives. So really looking forward to continuing this conversation and seeing how the book is received around the world. So again, thanks Luke for making the time, and hope to have you on again in a few years' time to see how things have panned out.
I hope so too, Ben, and thank you for having me.